The gravel crunched under Wade Kessler's boots the way it always had, 10,000 mornings on this same stretch of land. But this morning was different. A strip of red plastic tape fluttered from the barn door, and stapled crooked into the wood beneath it was a notice bearing the city seal. Wade pulled it free and read it once, then again. The words did not change. Condemnation notice. Structural failure risk. Vacate within 10 days. He looked up at the barn. Same tin roof his father replaced years ago. Same doors he had oiled that spring. Nothing about it had changed overnight. No inspector's truck had come up the drive. No one had walked the foundation or climbed into the loft. And yet here it was. A city order demanding he empty the building holding his tractor, his grain, his pumps, and the roof over 2 farmhands' heads. If nobody inspected this barn, who signed this order? And why now, 3 months after he refused the only offer anyone had made for this land? Wade Kessler was 46 years old, and nearly everything he owned that mattered sat within a half-mile of where he was standing. 4th generation on the Kessler farm, 210 acres of grain ground his great-grandfather had cleared by hand. His father had nearly lost it twice to bad years. Wade himself had spent 15 years paying the debt back down to zero before one drought season put a fresh note on the land. He had raised his daughter Emma mostly alone since his wife passed 6 years back. Emma was 15 now, sharp as a tack, already better at reading a grain moisture chart than half the hired hands Wade had ever brought on. The barn was not sentimental to him, or not only. It was the operational heart of the whole place. The tractor lived there. The irrigation pumps lived there. The grain dryer lived there. 2 hired hands bunked in the loft during harvest because driving in from town at 4 in the morning was not practical. Lose that barn for even 3 weeks, in the wrong 3 weeks, and Wade would not just lose convenience, he would lose the harvest. And if he lost the harvest stacked on top of last year's drought note, he would lose the farm. There had been one strange wrinkle back in spring. A developer's representative came by with an offer for Wade's road frontage acreage, the flattest, most buildable strip of the property, wanting to run a subdivision off the county road. Wade had said no without much thought. It was good ground. He needed it. His neighbor, Hal Pruitt, mentioned something offhand at the feed store weeks later. Heard the city's been awful cozy with that developer lately. Awful cozy. Wade had not thought much of it at the time. He was thinking about it now. City Hall smelled like burnt coffee and fresh carpet glue, the kind of smell that clung to government buildings no matter how new the paint looked. Wade sat in a plastic chair for 40 minutes, watching people come and go with folders and forms, before a woman in a sharp charcoal blazer finally stepped out to meet him. Her hand was already extended, her smile already fixed in place, practiced enough that Wade wondered how many times a day she used it. "Mr. Kessler, Marlene Voss, Director of Code Enforcement and Development. I understand you have questions about your notice." "I've got one question," Wade said, not bothering to sit back down. "Who inspected my barn?" Voss did not blink. She slid a manila folder across the counter toward him, her movements smooth and unhurried, like she had done this exact motion 100 times before. "Everything you need is right here." Wade opened it. Inside was a single page labeled Field Assessment, a signature at the bottom he had never seen in his life, and a photograph stapled to the corner. He looked at the photo, then looked up at Voss, then looked back at the photo. "This isn't my barn." Voss glanced at it, unbothered, as if he had pointed out a typo rather than proof that no one had ever set foot on his land. Sometimes our field database pulls the wrong parcel image. The assessment itself is accurate. Documented risk to public safety authorizes condemnation without a full walkthrough if the structure poses imminent hazard. It's right there in City Code, Section 14. Section 14 doesn't apply to agricultural structures. He did not know that for a fact yet, not with certainty. He was guessing, stitching together 20 years of property tax exemption paperwork he had signed without reading closely. But something flickered behind Voss's eyes before she smoothed her expression back into place, and that flicker told Wade more than the folder had. "I would have to check on that," she said, her voice still even, still pleasant. "In the meantime, Mr. Kessler, I want to be transparent with you. The city has an interest in resolving this quickly and painlessly for everyone involved. There is a fast-track option available to you. The city could acquire the barn's parcel directly. A fair price, no demolition costs on your end, and this whole unpleasant business disappears by the end of the week. Wade stared at her. You're offering to buy my barn, the one you just condemned, today. I'm offering you a way out of a costly, drawn-out process that will only get harder from here. I'll take the costly, drawn-out process. Something behind Voss's eyes shifted again, sharper this time, though her smile did not move an inch. That is certainly your right, she said. You have 10 days, Mr. Kessler. The clock does not pause for appeals. Funny, Wade said, tucking the folder under his arm. Nobody mentioned an appeals process yet, just a sale. Voss did not answer that. She simply extended her hand again, and Wade did not take it this time. He turned and walked out through the lobby, past the burnt coffee smell and the rows of plastic chairs, out into the parking lot where his truck sat waiting. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, turning the folder over in his hands like it might explain itself if he looked at it long enough. Wrong photo. A code section that did not sound right for a barn full of tractors and grain. A signature that belonged to no one he had ever met. And underneath all of it, an offer to buy the very building the city claimed was too dangerous to stand, wrapped up neat and fast before he had even had the chance to fight the order in front of anyone else. None of it added up to an accident. Mistakes did not usually come pre-packaged with a purchase offer. It added up to a plan that expected him to fold quietly, the way maybe others had folded before him, the way Hal's comment at the feed store had hinted somebody nearby already had. Wade started the truck. He was not planning on folding. The Public Records Office took 2 visits and a full week of stonewalling before Wade got anywhere close to an answer. On the first visit, a clerk barely glanced up from her screen. That file's still being processed. On the second, a different clerk gave him a slightly different version of the same wall. That file is pending redaction review. Wade left both times with nothing but a receipt number and a growing certainty that nobody intended to hand him anything useful. It was Dottie, a retired county clerk who had spent 30 years behind that same counter before handing in her badge, who finally gave it to him straight. They sat across from each other at the diner on Main Street, her coffee going cold as she stirred it slow and steady, clearly working up to something. "Baby, that inspection report wasn't field work," she said. "I've seen 100 of these cross my desk over the years. That one there, it was built off an aerial photo pulled straight from the county GIS system. Nobody walked your property, Wade. Nobody climbed into that loft or checked a single truss. Somebody sat at a desk and typed up whatever they needed it to say." Wade sat with that for a long moment, turning his own coffee cup slowly on the table. "Can you prove that?" "Not me. I'm retired, remember. But somebody could, if they knew exactly where to look, and if they had the standing to ask the right questions loud enough that the office couldn't keep stonewalling them." The 10-day clock did not care what anyone could or could not prove. It kept ticking regardless, and every day that passed narrowed Wade's options a little further. His 2 hired hands could not safely move the grain dryer or the bulk of the heavy equipment out of the barn in that kind of window, not without real risk of damage on the road, not without risking a lawsuit of their own if something broke loose during transport. The banknote on the farm was coming due in 3 weeks, drought season debt that had no patience for a barn fight. And at dinner one evening, Emma had gone quiet over her plate before asking, carefully, like she already suspected the answer, whether they were going to lose the house too, since she had overheard him on the phone saying the mortgage and the barn parcel were tied together on paper. Wade told her no. He was not entirely sure it was true when he said it. He hired the only attorney in 3 counties who had ever taken on the city and lived to talk about it, even if she had lost that fight 2 years back. Her name was Renata Cole, and she worked out of a cramped office above the hardware store, the kind of space that told you exactly how much the city establishment wanted her succeeding. "I'll be straight with you," Renata said, leaning back in a chair that creaked under her, files stacked in uneven towers around her desk. "Condemnation orders are brutal to fight from the outside looking in. The city holds nearly every card in this kind of dispute. Their inspector, their timeline, their interpretation of their own code. Judges tend to defer to municipal safety findings unless you can hand them something impossible to wave away." "So what's possible to hand them?" "A licensed structural engineer. Someone with a stamp and a reputation the city can't dismiss as a hired gun. Someone who walks that barn and puts findings on paper that a hearing officer has to take seriously, whether the city likes what it says or not." Then that's what we get, Wade said, and something in his voice must have convinced her, because Renata nodded once, sharp and decisive, and pulled a legal pad toward her to start taking notes. 3 days later, before Wade or Renata could arrange anything close to an inspection, a city crew showed up unannounced at the farm. No warning call, no letter, just 2 trucks and a foreman who would not quite meet Wade's eyes as his crew began unrolling chain-link fencing around the barn's perimeter. "For public safety," the foreman said, the words coming out flat and rehearsed, like he had been told exactly what to say if anyone asked. Wade stood at the edge of his own driveway and watched them fence off his tractor, his irrigation pumps, and half a season's worth of grain, sealing it all behind chain link before he had even managed to get Renata on the phone. By the time she picked up, the fence was nearly finished, and the last gap was closing fast. "They're locking me out of my own barn," Wade said, his voice tighter than he meant it to sound, "before we've even had a chance to get an engineer in there." There was a pause on the line, and when Renata spoke again, her voice had lost its earlier calm. "That's not standard procedure for a pending order. That's someone making sure you can't get ahead of them." Wade looked at the fence, at the padlock already hanging from the gate, at the barn he had walked through every single morning of his adult life, now sitting behind a barrier he had no key to. "Then we need that engineer in there today," he said, before they finished locking the whole thing down. The pressure did not let up after the fence went up. It multiplied. Within days, a daily fine began accruing on the county's books, tagged simply as non-compliance, as though Wade had any conceivable way to comply with an order demanding he vacate a building the city itself had sealed behind chain link. Each morning the number grew a little larger, a slow bleed designed to wear him down faster than any single blow could. Then the local paper ran its piece. Not the county's main paper, but a smaller weekly that, Wade noticed only after the fact, seemed to carry a suspicious number of full-page ads for Halstead Development Group. The article painted him as a landowner endangering the community, someone who had allegedly refused a safety inspection outright. Nobody from the paper had called him. Nobody had asked for his side before running it. Worse than the article was what appeared in his file a few days later. An anonymous complaint, typed and unsigned, alleging that Wade had threatened a city employee during his visit to Voss's office. It was a complete fabrication, invented from nothing, but Renata warned him it would take real, documented effort just to keep it from following him into any future hearing, sitting there in his file like a stain that would not wash out on its own. "They're not fighting fair," Wade said, sitting across from Renata in her cramped office, the fine notice and the newspaper clipping both spread out on the desk between them. "They're not fighting at all," Renata said. "Not in the way you mean. This isn't about winning an argument with you. This is about making the whole process too expensive and too exhausting for you to keep going. That's the entire strategy. Wear you down until the fast-track offer starts looking reasonable." Wade responded the only way he knew how, which was to keep working the problem instead of sitting still and absorbing the pressure. He tracked down Theo Osei, a licensed structural engineer based 2 counties over, known across the region for blunt, defensible reports that held up even in front of hostile audiences and skeptical hearing officers. Osei agreed to walk the property as soon as possible, before the fence crew could finish sealing off every last access point. Renata, meanwhile, filed an emergency motion for a stay, asking a judge to freeze the demolition clock until a licensed engineering review could be formally entered into the record. It was not a permanent fix. It bought them time, a window that might close as quickly as it had opened, but it was more room to breathe than they'd had a week earlier. Osei arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, climbing through a gap in the fence that the crew had not yet welded shut, a hard hat under one arm and a clipboard under the other. He worked methodically, checking the foundation first, then the load-bearing beams, then the trusses overhead, tapping and measuring and making notes in a small, precise hand. "Off the record, before my report's finished," Osei said, stepping back from the last beam he had inspected. "This building isn't going anywhere. Foundation's solid. Trusses are sound. Whatever they wrote in that assessment of yours, it wasn't describing what I'm looking at right now." Relief moved through Wade's chest, sharp and immediate, the first real breath he had taken in days. But Osei was not finished. He had walked a slow perimeter around the barn's exterior, following the tree line out toward the property boundary, and he stopped short near the edge of the fenced area, staring down at the ground. "Wade, Come look at this. Wade crossed to where Osei stood. A neat line of fresh survey stakes ran through the grass, orange flags snapping lightly in the wind, planted in a straight, deliberate line that cut directly through the barn's footprint and continued out toward the frontage acreage beyond it. Wade had seen a line almost exactly like it before, months earlier. On a glossy site plan a developer's representative had unfolded across his kitchen table, back before he had said no to the offer and sent the man on his way. "That's Halstead's proposed layout," Wade said quietly, the pieces sliding together in his mind faster than he wanted them to. "That's their subdivision line, running right through my barn." Osei crouched down beside the nearest stake, studying it without touching it. "Somebody planted these recently. Ground around the base hasn't settled yet." Wade stood there a long moment, looking from the stakes to the barn to the fence surrounding it, understanding now with a cold, settling certainty that this had never been about safety at all. It had been about clearing a parcel for a project he had already refused to sell into. "Get it in writing," Wade said. "Everything you just told me. I want it on paper before they find a way to move those stakes." Theo Osei's full written report landed 6 days later, and it did not hedge on a single point. The barn was structurally sound for its use classification. Full stop. There was no imminent hazard, documented or otherwise, anywhere in the building. And in the margins, in the same blunt tone Osei had used standing in the barn that gray Tuesday morning, he noted that the city's original assessment appeared to reference a building code section written for commercial retail structures, one that had never applied to agricultural buildings in the first place, not under any reasonable reading of the code. That was the first piece, and on its own it might have been enough to win a narrower fight. A licensed engineer's stamp carried weight most homeowners never got the chance to bring into a hearing room. But Wade had learned enough in the last few weeks to know that proving the barn was safe would not, by itself, explain why the city had condemned it in the first place, or why a fence crew had shown up before anyone had even finished reviewing the case. Soundness of a structure was one argument. Motive behind a false order was another, and Wade wanted both sitting on the table before this went anywhere near a hearing officer. The second piece came from Renata's records request, the one that had been stonewalled twice and delayed with a formal appeal before it finally, grudgingly, produced results. A batch of internal emails arrived from the city's own server, exchanged between Marlene Voss's office and a project manager at Halstead Development. The emails did not bother with careful language. They talked plainly about clearing the parcel and resolving the barn issue ahead of schedule, phrases that meant nothing on their own until Renata cross-referenced the dates against the county's inspection log. One email, sent from Voss's account, referenced the condemnation order by its draft date. That date came 10 full days before any inspection had ever been logged into the city's own system. There was no way to read that as coincidence. The order existed on paper before the excuse for the order existed. Renata spread the printouts across her desk, lining them up chronologically, tapping each date in turn as she walked Wade through what they meant. "This isn't sloppy paperwork anymore, Wade. This is a paper trail showing the decision came first, and the justification got built around it afterward. That's a different animal entirely in front of a hearing officer." The third piece walked in on its own 2 feet, and it did so on a Thursday evening, just as Renata was locking up her office for the night. Rick Delgado stood in the doorway looking like he had not slept in days, 26 years old and clearly out of his depth in whatever he had been asked to carry. He was a junior code enforcement officer, someone Wade had never met and would not have recognized on the street, but he introduced himself quietly and asked if he could come in and talk. Renata sat him down and said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence do its work the way experienced attorneys often do. Wade watched Rick's hands, restless in his lap, fingers picking at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve, and recognized something in the young man's posture he had seen before in farmhands about to admit they had made a costly mistake out in the field. It was the look of someone who had spent days rehearsing a confession and still was not sure he had the nerve to get through it. "You don't have to say anything tonight," Renata said gently, "but if you're here, I'm guessing there's something you need to say." "She told me to backdate the file," Rick finally said, staring at a spot on the floor rather than at either of them. "Said it was just paperwork cleanup, nothing that mattered. I didn't think it through at the time. I didn't think it would go this far, not to fences and fines and a man's whole harvest sitting on the line." "Would you say that in front of a hearing officer?" Renata asked. "Under oath, on the record, with your name attached to it?" Rick was quiet a long moment, his jaw working like he was still deciding, even now, whether he could live with either choice in front of him. Then he nodded, slow but certain. "Yes," he said, "I would." Wade sat back in his chair once Rick had gone, the office quiet again except for the hum of the old window unit and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street below. He let the weight of the evening settle over him properly for the first time, the kind of stillness that only comes after weeks of moving too fast to feel anything fully. 3 months earlier, he had been standing in his own driveway, reading a red notice zip-tied to his barn door, with no idea in the world what he was up against, or why any of it was happening. Now he had, laid out across Renata's desk in black and white, exactly what he was up against. A licensed engineer's report proving the city's safety claim was fabricated from nothing. An email trail proving the order was written before its justification existed. And a witness willing to say, out loud and under oath, that he had been personally instructed to falsify a government document. It was not luck that had brought them here. It was Renata's persistence through 2 flat denials and a formal appeal. It was Osei's refusal to write anything softer than what he had actually found in that barn. It was Dottie's quiet tip over cold diner coffee, and Rick's decision, however late and however frightened, to walk through that office door and tell the truth anyway. "We don't just have a defense anymore," Renata said, closing the last folder and squaring the stack of printouts on her desk. "We have grounds to force this whole thing into a public hearing, on the record, where Voss can't quietly bury it the way she buried the truth about that inspection." Wade looked at the folder, then out the window at the darkened street below, thinking of the fence still standing around his barn, the fines still accruing on the county's books, the grain still sitting untouched inside a building he was not legally allowed to enter. "Then let's do it," he said. "Let's put every bit of this on the record." Renata almost smiled, the first real one Wade had seen from her since he had walked into her office weeks earlier. "That's exactly what I intend to do." The city council chambers were standing room only the night Wade's case came up on the agenda, a fact that surprised no one who had read that week's paper, since word travels fast in a small county. Once people start asking why a neighbor's barn got fenced off without a single inspector ever setting foot on the land. Folding chairs had been dragged in from a storage closet to line the back wall, and even those had filled up 20 minutes before the meeting started. Wade sat at the front table beside Renata, his hands folded on top of a manila folder thick with Osei's report, the printed emails, and Renata's own notes for exactly how she planned to walk through all of it. Emma sat 2 rows back with Hal Pruitt, who had insisted on driving her himself so Wade would not have to worry about her getting home late. Wade caught her eye once before the meeting started, and she gave him a small, tight nod, the kind that told him she understood exactly how much rode on the next hour, even if neither of them said it out loud. Around the room, faces Wade recognized from the feed store, from church, from 20 years of small county life, sat waiting with the particular patience of people who had shown up because they already suspected something larger than one man's barn was at stake. A few reporters he did not recognize sat near the back, notebooks open, a different breed entirely from the writer who had penned the earlier hit piece, without ever picking up a phone to call him. When their item finally came up, Renata rose and walked the council through Osei's report, line by line. Foundation measurements first, then load calculations for the trusses overhead, then the specific building code section the city's original assessment had cited, the one written for commercial retail structures, and never intended for barns. She kept her language plain, deliberately so, translating engineering terms into sentences anyone in the room could follow without a technical background, because she wanted the point landing with the neighbors in the folding chairs just as much as with the 5 council members behind the dais. "This building was never in danger of failing," Renata said, closing the report and setting it flat on the table. "What was in danger was a plan to clear this parcel before anyone asked too many questions about why." Marlene Voss, when her turn came, stayed composed, her voice smooth and unbothered in a way that had clearly worked for her in rooms like this before. "This was standard procedure, conducted in good faith," she said, addressing the council rather than Wade or Renata directly. "Field assessments occasionally rely on remote data when scheduling constraints prevent immediate walkthroughs. That does not make the underlying finding invalid, nor does it suggest any impropriety on the part of my office." It was a practiced answer, and for a moment it seemed to land the way it was meant to, a few council members nodding along out of habit more than conviction. Then Renata called Rick Delgado to the podium. The room went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone senses something is about to break open. A stillness that settled over the folding chairs and the dais alike. Rick's voice shook badly at first, catching on the first few words, but it steadied as he described being told to backdate the inspection file, told it was just paperwork cleanup that would not matter to anyone. He said it plainly, without embellishment, a small sentence landing in that quiet room like a dropped plate in a silent kitchen, sharp and impossible to ignore. A councilwoman near the end of the dais, who had been nodding along with Voss only minutes earlier, now leaned forward, her expression sharpening into something closer to suspicion. "Director Voss, I want to understand something. Mr. Delgado just testified he was instructed to backdate a file. Can you explain why an internal email, provided to this council as part of tonight's record, references this parcel's clearance a full 10 days before any inspection appears in your own department system?" Voss's answer came a beat too slow, the first crack in her composure all evening. "I would need to review that specific email before commenting on its context." "You wrote it, Director Voss," Renata said quietly, sliding a printed copy across the table toward the dais. "It's right here, time-stamped and signed with your own account credentials." The room shifted, a low murmur moving through the folding chairs, and Voss's carefully neutral expression flickered for the first time all night. Then Hal Pruitt stood up from the third row, uninvited, raising his hand to ask if he might speak. The council chair, caught slightly off guard, allowed it after a brief pause. Hal talked about a quiet visit he had gotten from a Halstead representative back in the spring, someone who had come by unannounced with an offer for a strip of his own land bordering the county road. Nothing official had come of it at the time, he said, just a vague, uneasy pressure afterward, a feeling he could not quite name until he watched Wade's fight play out over the past several weeks and understood exactly what he had been circling without realizing it. "I didn't think much of it back then," Hal said, his voice steady despite the room full of eyes on him. "Man in a nice truck, friendly enough, made an offer. I said, not right now, and he left. I figured that was the end of it. But sitting here tonight, hearing what happened to Wade, I don't think it was the end of anything. I think it was the start of something a lot of us just didn't recognize yet." It was not one man's bad luck anymore, sitting alone and isolated. It was a pattern, and the room could feel it click into place all at once. A collective shift in understanding that moved through the folding chairs like a current. For the first time all evening, Marlene Voss did not have a smooth answer ready. She sat very still at her table, her hands folded in front of her, and said nothing at all while the council chair called for a formal administrative hearing to be scheduled, one with sworn testimony and a real record that could not be quietly buried in a filing cabinet the way the original inspection had been. Wade felt Renata's hand briefly touch his arm under the table, a small, steadying gesture, and when he glanced back at Emma, she was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face in weeks, something closer to relief than worry. Hal caught his eye too and gave him a slow nod, the kind exchanged between men who had just watched something shift for good, even if the paperwork had not caught up yet. The meeting had not ended the fight. There was still a formal hearing ahead, still a demolition clock technically ticking somewhere in the background of the county's books, still fines that had not yet been reversed on paper. But for the first time since the red notice appeared on his barn door, Wade left a room feeling like the ground beneath him had finally stopped shifting. Like the truth, once it was finally said out loud in front of enough people, had a weight of its own that no amount of backdated paperwork could undo. The council had no choice in the end but to push the matter into a formal administrative hearing, the kind with a hearing officer, sworn testimony, and a real record that could not be quietly buried in a filing cabinet the way the original inspection had been. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, in a smaller, more formal room down the hall from the council chambers, one with a raised bench and a court reporter typing steadily at a small table off to the side. Wade spent those 3 weeks the way he had spent most of the last 2 months, splitting his attention between the farm and the fight, watching Renata build the case brick by brick with a patience that sometimes tested his own. Osei's report was finalized and bound. The emails were formatted and indexed by date. Rick had agreed formally this time in writing to testify under oath. Harvest pressed on regardless of any of it. Wade and his 2 hired hands worked around the fence as best they could, hauling what equipment they were legally permitted to touch, borrowing a neighbor's grain cart for the parts of the job the barn's own machinery would normally have handled. Emma helped where she could after school, keeping a running tally of what still needed doing once the fence finally came down, a small, stubborn act of faith that it would, in fact, come down. On the morning of the hearing, Wade dressed in the one suit he owned, the same one he had worn to his wife's funeral 6 years earlier, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror a long moment before Emma knocked on the door to tell him Renata had texted. They needed to leave. The hearing officer was a retired judge named Corrales, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper reputation for having little patience for excuses dressed up as procedure. She entered the room precisely on time, took her seat behind the raised bench, and opened the proceedings without preamble. Renata built the case like a wall, brick by brick, methodical and unhurried, refusing to let any single piece of evidence stand alone when it could be reinforced by another. Osei's licensed report went in first, entered as controlling technical evidence against the city's unsigned, misdated field assessment. Renata walked Corrales through every discrepancy in turn. The wrong photograph originally attached to the file, the building code section written for commercial retail structures and never intended for barns, the complete absence of any documented walkthrough prior to the notice being issued. The city's own paperwork, Renata said, holding up the original field assessment beside Osei's bound report, cannot withstand comparison to an actual inspection conducted by a licensed professional. One of these documents describes a real building, the other describes nothing at all. Then came the emails, laid out chronologically on a screen at the front of the room, timestamps highlighted in yellow beside the corresponding entries from the city's own inspection log. Renata did not need to editorialize much. The dates spoke plainly enough on their own. An email discussing clearing the parcel, sent from Voss's account, dated a full 10 days before any inspection entry existed anywhere in the city's system. This is not a case of imperfect procedure, Renata said, addressing Corrales directly now. This is a case of a decision made first, and a justification manufactured afterward to support it. Then Rick took the stand, sworn in properly this time, his voice steadier than it had been in the council chambers weeks earlier, as though the formal setting had given him something solid to hold on to, rather than shaking him further. He repeated what he had told Renata and Wade in that cramped office weeks before, the instruction to backdate the file, the assurance from Voss that it was simple paperwork cleanup, nothing that would matter to anyone. "Did Director Voss tell you why the file needed to be backdated?" Renata asked. "She said it needed to look like it happened before the fence went up," Rick said. "Said it would be cleaner that way if anyone ever asked questions." A murmur moved through the small gallery of observers seated behind Wade, and Corrales made a note without looking up. When it was Voss's turn, she took the stand with her composure largely intact, though Wade noticed a stiffness in her shoulders that had not been there in their first meeting at City Hall months earlier. She answered the initial questions smoothly enough, reiterating that field assessments sometimes relied on remote data, that scheduling constraints occasionally necessitated shortcuts that did not reflect any impropriety. Corrales let her finish, then leaned forward slightly, her tone flat and unhurried in the way of someone who had heard 1,000 practiced answers and was no longer interested in polish. "Director Voss, this email is dated the 14th. Your office's own inspection log shows no entry for this property until the 22nd. Please explain that discrepancy to me directly." Voss's composure held for a moment longer. "The email reflects informal, preliminary discussion. It does not represent a final decision. And yet the condemnation order itself references language nearly identical to that email," Corrales said, holding up a second document, issued before any inspection had occurred. "Mr. Delgado has testified under oath that you personally instructed him to alter the dated record of that inspection. Are you disputing his testimony?" "I believe Mr. Delgado misunderstood an instruction," Voss said, her voice tightening slightly despite her effort to keep it even. "The developer relationship referenced in that email is entirely unrelated to the condemnation proceeding. It concerns a separate parcel discussion that has no bearing on Mr. Kessler's barn." "Then perhaps you can explain," Corrales said, "why the parcel referenced in this email matches the address on the condemnation order word for word." Voss did not have an answer ready this time. The silence stretched long enough that even the court reporter's typing paused, waiting. Wade watched her hands, folded tightly on the table in front of her, knuckles pale against the dark wood, and understood he was watching someone realize in real time that every contingency she had planned for did not include a junior officer with enough conscience left to walk into an attorney's office on a Thursday evening. "Director Voss," Corrales said again when the silence had stretched past the point of comfortable, "I am waiting for an answer." "The dates do not move, Director Voss," Corrales said finally, her voice quiet now, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than if she had raised it. "The signatures do not change, and this hearing has now heard sworn testimony from a member of your own staff describing a direct instruction to falsify a government record. I am not inclined to interpret any of that as coincidence." Voss said nothing further. She sat very still, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and for the first time since Wade had walked into her office months earlier, demanding to know who had inspected his barn, she looked, unmistakably, like someone who understood the ground had shifted permanently beneath her. Corrales did not take long to rule. She reviewed her notes for a few minutes in silence, then addressed the room directly, her voice carrying easily to every corner without needing to be raised. "This hearing finds that the condemnation order issued against the property at question was improperly issued, based on a fabricated field assessment referencing an inapplicable code section, and supported by falsified inspection records created at the direction of the Director of Code Enforcement and Development. The order is vacated, effective immediately, and shall be entered into the public record as such." A quiet exhale moved through the gallery, the kind of collective breath that comes after weeks of holding tension no one quite named out loud. "All accrued fines related to this order are voided in full," Corrales continued. "The city is ordered to remove the perimeter fencing from the property within 24 hours of this ruling, and Director Voss's conduct in this matter, including the falsification of official records and the undisclosed communication with an outside development interest regarding a parcel under active enforcement, will be referred for formal internal review." Wade sat very still through most of it, the words landing slowly, one at a time, like he needed each one to fully settle before he could believe it belonged to him. 2 months of fines, fences, stonewalled records requests, a fabricated complaint sitting in his file, a newspaper article calling him reckless without ever once picking up the phone to ask his side. And all of it had just been undone in the space of a few sentences from a woman he had met for the first time 20 minutes earlier. It did not feel like winning, not in the way he had imagined it might during the worst of the sleepless nights. It felt more like finally being allowed to set something down that he had been carrying so long his arms had gone numb to the weight of it. It was Emma, watching from the second row beside Hal, who cried first. Quiet tears she did not bother wiping away, her hand finding Hal's arm for a moment before she caught herself and sat up straighter. Renata reached over and shook Wade's hand once, briskly, professionally, though there was real warmth behind it. "It's over," she said. "The order's gone. The fence comes down tomorrow." Wade looked past her, toward the back of the room where Voss sat motionless at the city's table, her staff already beginning to gather papers around her in a silence that had nothing professional left in it. Whatever ambitions she had been quietly building toward, whatever commissioner run had been waiting on the other side of a clean record and a cooperative development partner, all of it had just ended in this room, on this record, in front of every neighbor who had shown up to watch. Wade did not feel triumphant. Not exactly. Mostly he felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes only after setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. He thought, briefly and without much bitterness, of the 10 days the original notice had given him, of how much had happened in the weeks since, of how close the whole thing had come to going the other way if Dottie had not spoken up over cold coffee, if Osei had not noticed the survey stakes, if Rick had lost his nerve on that Thursday evening and simply gone home instead of knocking on Renata's door. None of it had been guaranteed. All of it had mattered. "Let's go home," he said to Emma, once the room had mostly cleared. "There's a fence to watch come down tomorrow." The fence came down the next morning, right on schedule for once, a crew arriving before 8 to unbolt the same panels they had installed weeks earlier, working quickly and without much conversation, as though eager to be done with a job none of them had liked in the first place. Wade stood at the edge of the driveway watching the last section come free, and when the gate finally swung open, he walked through it himself, rather than waiting for anyone's permission, boots crossing the same threshold he had crossed 10,000 mornings before, though this particular crossing felt different in a way he could not fully put into words. He backed the tractor out slow and deliberate, feeling every foot of that drive back into his own hands, the engine's familiar rattle sounding almost like relief. The grain dryer started up without complaint. The irrigation pumps ran exactly the way they always had. By the end of the week, the equipment was fully back in use, and the harvest that had nearly slipped away moved forward on something close to its original schedule, a little behind where it should have been, but not so far behind that the season was lost. The hired hands moved back into the loft without needing to say much about it. Some things, Wade had learned, did not require a speech. They just needed to go back to normal, quietly, the way they always had before a red notice appeared on a barn door and turned everything sideways for 2 months. One of the hands, a quiet man named Earl who had worked the farm 3 seasons running, paused in the doorway his first night back and looked around the barn a long moment before saying simply, "Good to be home." And Wade understood exactly what he meant, even though neither of them had ever lived inside the building itself. In the evenings that followed, Wade found himself standing in the barn doorway at dusk more often than he used to, watching Emma help him log the moisture readings on the drying grain, the whole operation humming along the way it had for 4 generations before either of them existed. She had gotten good at it over the past 2 months, faster than he expected for someone her age, and he wondered sometimes whether the fight had aged her in ways he could not entirely see yet, or whether she had simply grown into herself a little faster than most 15-year-olds got the chance to. "You did good," he told her one evening, watching her double-check a reading against the chart taped inside the barn door. "Through all of it, you did good." Emma shrugged, the way teenagers do when a compliment lands somewhere they are not quite ready to hold on to yet. "I just did homework and worried a lot," she said. "You're the one who fought the city." "We both fought it," Wade said. "Different ways. Both mattered." The story did not stay quiet after the hearing, and this time that worked in Wade's favor rather than against him. The same paper that had once painted him as reckless ran a formal correction, followed a week later by a longer piece detailing the falsified inspection and Voss's referral for internal review, written by a reporter who this time had actually called Wade for comment before publishing anything. Other landowners who had quietly caved to similar pressure over the years started coming forward once Wade's case became public record, one after another, small stories that had gone untold for lack of anyone willing to fight loud enough to make the pattern visible. A woman 2 townships over who had sold a strip of pasture at a lowball price rather than fight a similar notice. A retired couple who had abandoned an addition to their home rather than deal with an inspector who never seemed to schedule a real walkthrough. Each story on its own had looked like an isolated bad break. Together, they read like exactly what they were, and the county opened a formal audit into Voss's department that, by the time it finished, went back years further than anyone involved had initially guessed. Hal Pruitt came by the farm more often after that, not as an anxious neighbor working up the nerve to mention something he had noticed, but as something closer to a real friend, the kind made in a shared fight rather than a shared fence line. He and Wade fell into an easy habit of standing at the edge of the field some evenings, talking about nothing in particular, the developer's offer and the survey stakes, and the whole ordeal receding slowly into something they could finally talk about without either man's jaw tightening. Renata's win became local news for the right reasons this time, and Wade suspected, though she never said it outright, that the case had done more for her practice than 2 years of steady work before it had. Her office above the hardware store, once a place people avoided out of quiet skepticism that anyone could actually beat the city, started fielding calls from landowners across 3 counties who wanted her name attached to their own disputes. She stopped by the farm once, weeks after the hearing, just to see the barn standing open and functional the way it was supposed to be, and stood in the doorway a long moment taking it in. "This is what it was always about," she said. "Not the hearing. This." Wade did not gloat about any of it, not to the paper that finally ran its correction, not to the council members who offered careful, procedural apologies once the audit findings started coming in. He was too tired for gloating, and too aware of exactly what the fight had cost him. Months of stress he could not get back, legal fees that had eaten into savings he had spent 15 years rebuilding, a harvest that had come in leaner than it should have, and a daughter who had spent 2 months of her 15th year worrying about whether her family would still have a home by the end of it. But he also knew, standing in that barn doorway some evening with Emma beside him, exactly what the alternative would have looked like if he had taken Voss's fast-track offer that first day at City Hall. A quiet sale, a quick disappearance of the whole unpleasant business. And somewhere down the road, a subdivision sitting where his family's barn had stood for 4 generations, with no one left to ask the questions that had finally cracked the whole thing open. He thought of his father, who had replaced that tin roof decades ago expecting it to outlast him, and his great-grandfather, who had cleared this ground by hand with no way of knowing what any of his descendants would one day have to fight to keep it. He would take tired and right over easy and wrong every single time. The fence came down the next morning, right on schedule for once, a crew arriving before 8 to unbolt the same panels they had installed weeks earlier, working quickly and without much conversation, as though eager to be done with a job none of them had liked in the first place. Wade stood at the edge of the driveway watching the last section come free, and when the gate finally swung open, he walked through it himself, rather than waiting for anyone's permission, boots crossing the same threshold he had crossed 10,000 mornings before, though this particular crossing felt different in a way he could not fully put into words. He backed the tractor out slow and deliberate, feeling every foot of that drive back into his own hands, the engine's familiar rattle sounding almost like relief. The grain dryer started up without complaint. The irrigation pumps ran exactly the way they always had. By the end of the week, the equipment was fully back in use, and the harvest that had nearly slipped away moved forward on something close to its original schedule, a little behind where it should have been, but not so far behind that the season was lost. The hired hands moved back into the loft without needing to say much about it. Some things, Wade had learned, did not require a speech. They just needed to go back to normal, quietly, the way they always had before a red notice appeared on a barn door and turned everything sideways for 2 months. One of the hands, a quiet man named Earl who had worked the farm 3 seasons running, paused in the doorway his first night back and looked around the barn a long moment before saying simply, "Good to be home." And Wade understood exactly what he meant, even though neither of them had ever lived inside the building itself. In the evenings that followed, Wade found himself standing in the barn doorway at dusk more often than he used to, watching Emma help him log the moisture readings on the drying grain, the whole operation humming along the way it had for 4 generations before either of them existed. She had gotten good at it over the past 2 months, faster than he expected for someone her age, and he wondered sometimes whether the fight had aged her in ways he could not entirely see yet, or whether she had simply grown into herself a little faster than most 15-year-olds got the chance to. "You did good," he told her one evening, watching her double-check a reading against the chart taped inside the barn door. "Through all of it, you did good." Emma shrugged, the way teenagers do when a compliment lands somewhere they are not quite ready to hold on to yet. "I just did homework and worried a lot," she said. "You're the one who fought the city." "We both fought it," Wade said. "Different ways. Both mattered." The story did not stay quiet after the hearing, and this time that worked in Wade's favor rather than against him. The same paper that had once painted him as reckless ran a formal correction, followed a week later by a longer piece detailing the falsified inspection and Voss's referral for internal review, written by a reporter who this time had actually called Wade for comment before publishing anything. Other landowners who had quietly caved to similar pressure over the years started coming forward once Wade's case became public record, one after another, small stories that had gone untold for lack of anyone willing to fight loud enough to make the pattern visible. A woman 2 townships over who had sold a strip of pasture at a lowball price rather than fight a similar notice. A retired couple who had abandoned an addition to their home rather than deal with an inspector who never seemed to schedule a real walkthrough. Each story on its own had looked like an isolated bad break. Together, they read like exactly what they were, and the county opened a formal audit into Voss's department that, by the time it finished, went back years further than anyone involved had initially guessed. Hal Pruitt came by the farm more often after that, not as an anxious neighbor working up the nerve to mention something he had noticed, but as something closer to a real friend, the kind made in a shared fight rather than a shared fence line. He and Wade fell into an easy habit of standing at the edge of the field some evenings, talking about nothing in particular, the developer's offer and the survey stakes, and the whole ordeal receding slowly into something they could finally talk about without either man's jaw tightening. Renata's win became local news for the right reasons this time, and Wade suspected, though she never said it outright, that the case had done more for her practice than 2 years of steady work before it had. Her office above the hardware store, once a place people avoided out of quiet skepticism that anyone could actually beat the city, started fielding calls from landowners across 3 counties who wanted her name attached to their own disputes. She stopped by the farm once, weeks after the hearing, just to see the barn standing open and functional the way it was supposed to be, and stood in the doorway a long moment taking it in. "This is what it was always about," she said. "Not the hearing. This." Wade did not gloat about any of it. Not to the paper that finally ran its correction, not to the council members who offered careful, procedural apologies once the audit findings started coming in. He was too tired for gloating, and too aware of exactly what the fight had cost him. Months of stress he could not get back. Legal fees that had eaten into savings he had spent 15 years rebuilding. A harvest that had come in leaner than it should have. And a daughter who had spent 2 months of her 15th year worrying about whether her family would still have a home by the end of it. But he also knew, standing in that barn doorway some evening with Emma beside him, exactly what the alternative would have looked like if he had taken Voss's fast-track offer that first day at City Hall. A quiet sale. A quick disappearance of the whole unpleasant business. And somewhere down the road, a subdivision sitting where his family's barn had stood for 4 generations, with no one left to ask the questions that had finally cracked the whole thing open. He thought of his father, who had replaced that tin roof decades ago expecting it to outlast him, and his great-grandfather, who had cleared this ground by hand with no way of knowing what any of his descendants would one day have to fight to keep it. He would take tired and right over easy and wrong every single time.